Hi everyone, for our service learning project, we are going to speak about overrepresentation of English language learners in special education. Hi everyone, I'm Sophia, and I want to speak about what is overrepresentation in special education. Overrepresentation occurs when the percentages of minority students in special education exceeds the percentage of these students in the total student population. Over the past 30 years, the U.S. public school system has been grappling with the challenge of including quality educational experiences and the overrepresentation of culturally and linguistically diverse children in special education. Today, there is a major disproportion in special education services depending on the student's race and background. Factors that contribute to the overrepresentation of ELLs in special education. One factor is language barriers. ELLs may face challenges in understanding and expressing themselves in English, which can affect their performance on assessments and lead to misinterpretations of their abilities. Language difficulties might be mistakenly perceived as learning disabilities or developmental delays, resulting in an over-identification for special education services. Second factor is culturally and linguistic bias. Standardized tests and assessment tools used to identify students for special education may be culturally and linguistically biased, which can disproportionately impact ELLs. The assessments might not adequately capture their true abilities and potentials, leading to misclassifications and overrepresentation. Third factor is limited English proficiency. ELLs who are still in the process of acquiring English proficiency might struggle with academic content due to their limited language skills. This can result in academic difficulties being mistakenly attributed to learning disabilities or other special needs. A fourth factor that can contribute to overrepresentation of ELLs in special education is inadequate instructional support. ELLs may not receive appropriate language support and accommodations in the mainstream classroom, which can hinder their academic progress. Without adequate linguistic and instructional support, ELLs may fall behind their peers, increasing their likelihood of referral to special education. Number 5, inappropriate referral and assessment practices. Biased referral practices or reliance on a single assessment measure without considering other factors such as cultural and linguistic backgrounds may contribute to over-identification of ELLs for special education services. It is important to use comprehensive and culturally responsive assessment methods that consider multiple sources of information. The sixth factor that may contribute to the overrepresentation of ELLs in special education is the lack of teacher training and expertise. Educators may have limited training or knowledge in effectively supporting the diverse needs of ELLs in mainstream classrooms. This can result in inadequate differentiation of instruction and inappropriate referrals to special education when language barriers are not properly addressed. Number 7, inaccurate parental consent and involvement. Language barriers and cultural differences may affect parental understanding and involvement in the special education referral and assessment process. Miscommunication or misunderstandings could lead to incorrect decisions about a student's needs and potential overrepresentation.
Hi, my name is Katie Skoda, and I will be covering overrepresentation of ethnic groups in special education. So, there are a number of reasons that contribute to the overrepresentation of ethnic groups in special education. Some of these contributions to overrepresentation are listed below, but they are not limited to bias, cultural and linguistic differences, poverty, and lack of funding. These differences in identification and placement have been noted by several states and districts, according to research. First, how does bias affect overrepresentation of ethnic groups in special education? Bias, whether it is done conscious or unconscious, can be influenced by linguistic barriers, cultural prejudices, and teacher expectations. For example, Native American students comprise 1.6% of those identified as having a disability who receive special education services, despite making up only 1.1% of the total student population in public schools. I also want to note here that it is important to remember that special education eligibility is not only dependent on one aspect, such as biases, but also takes into account a student's specific demands and disabilities. But according to research, Native American students are more likely to receive an emotional or behavioral disorder diagnosis than their white peers. This can be due to implicit biases or unconscious biases among educators and school administrators. Moving forward, we will discuss how does cultural and linguistic factors affect overrepresentation of ethnic groups. Teachers may incorrectly perceive kids' actions or language skills as indicators of a learning disability or behavioral issue, which results in unjustified referrals to special education programs. For example, despite making up 26.8% of the total student population in public schools, Hispanic students make up 15.1% of all students identified as having a disability and receiving special education services. Hispanic students may have cultural and linguistic differences that are not always understood in educational settings. For example, English may not be the first language spoken in the home, or maybe they are coming from a Hispanic-speaking country, which can make it even more difficult for them to learn in a classroom where instruction is primarily given in English. Another contribution to overrepresentation of ethnic groups in special education is poverty. So how does poverty affect overrepresentation of ethnic groups? Children from low-income homes may not have access to the tools and support needed to succeed academically. Overrepresentation can take place here as students coming from low-income homes cannot receive the appropriate resources to achieve academically. An indicator of poverty is free or reduced price meals. When we look at the African American student population throughout the U.S., 61% of African American students, which is approximately 3.4 million African American students in public schools, are qualified for free or reduced price meals. I do want to note it is crucial to remember that special education eligibility is not only dependent on one aspect, such as economic status, but also takes into account a student's specific demands and disabilities. Nonetheless, 20.2% of African American students have been diagnosed as having a disability and are getting special education services, whereas 13.3% of all students are African American. Finally, how does the lack of funding affect overrepresentation of ethnic groups in special education? Many schools lack the funding necessary to offer high-quality special education services, which disproportionately affect students of color. According to the statistics mentioned in the previous slides, we can note the lack of funding disproportionately affecting students of color. A study found that schools serving a larger proportion of children with disabilities typically get fewer funds than schools serving a smaller proportion of those with disabilities. The results of overrepresentation of ethnic groups are as follows, but are not limited to stigmatization, disproportionate discipline, and limited opportunities. Students who are overrepresented in special education programs may feel stigmatized and labeled as inferior or less capable than their peers, according to research. This labeling can have long-term negative effects on their self-esteem and academic achievement. Overrepresented students in special education programs could also experience disproportionate discipline, such as suspension and expulsion. Students who are overrepresented in special education programs might not have as many opportunities to participate in extracurricular activities and general education curriculum, which could result in little or no motivation to learn or succeed in the academic setting and possibly not even pursue post-secondary education. Furthermore, this inequality in discipline can result in a pathway from school to jail. There are several ways to stop overrepresentation of our students in special education programs. Some of these ways are as follows, but are not limited to implementing more equitable and inclusive referral and identification processes, improving cultural competency training for educators, and training for RTIs and IEPs for educators.
It's Izzy, and I'll be presenting the IEP section. So an IEP stands for the Individualized Education Plan, and these plans are mandated by IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Basically, it's a layout of the instructional approaches, services, and supports that students who are classified will need in academic settings. This could be things like extended time, if they should be in a self-contained classroom or an ICT classroom, if they need to go to counseling, everything like that. It basically just is an outline of their supports and what they would need in the academic setting to succeed along with the rest of their classmates. So who is on the IEP team? The IEP team usually consists of a district member, and that could be sometimes the special education chair, psychologist, the special education teacher of the specific student, a general education teacher of the specific student, service providers such as counseling, occupational therapy, physical therapy. Number 6 is ELL support. So if they are an English language learner, they can be provided with their ELL teacher or a translator, which leads into number 7, which is parents, who are a very important part of the IEP team. They can oversee and come to meetings and make sure that their input is given when the members of the school are making their child's IEP. So this is a sample of an IEP. It has on the top the student, her disability, she has a learning disability, which class it's for, and the teacher, and it starts off saying her strength and needs, so saying that she enjoys creative writing, along with her difficulty with the conventions of writing, so grammar, spelling, punctuation. She's shy. Basically, the overview just describes the student, which is very important. And then it goes into their goal for writing and then the accommodations to get to that goal. So it has allows student to type homework, write daily agenda and objectives on the board so they make sure that they're following along, work on proper pencil grip if it's a physical disability, mini lessons, and then it goes into testing accommodations, which is extended time on tests and use of computer if requested by student. So each IEP is going to be different for each specific classified student based on their abilities, along with their disabilities and their strengths and their needs and supports. So what we think the proper intervention, specifically with RTI and IEP, is to provide staff members and educators proper training and professional development that prevent overrepresentation of students based on their background and language, specifically culturally diverse students like English language learners. These training sessions should focus on approaches that prevent bias and misdiagnosing when classifying a student. For example, how to tell the difference between a language disability versus a learning disability. A lot of times ELLs abilities can be confused with learning disabilities or something that is classified under IDEA. So it's imperative that teachers are properly trained and special educators are properly trained with classifying students.
Hi everyone, it's Mike, and I'm going to be presenting the response to intervention section of this presentation. So firstly, we need to establish a baseline of what is response to intervention, or RTI. So response intervention, or RTI, is a process by which students are provided with increasingly more intensive classroom supports to gauge the need for special education services. Now, this process can be done in both the classroom with other students involved or in a more intensive one-on-one or small group setting. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and take a look at the RTI process. So the response to intervention process centers itself around a 3-tiered system by which, as the different tiers are initiated, the integrated supports become progressively more intensive. And in diagram form, this process is commonly depicted as a pyramid within the 3 tiers to depict that. It is worth noting that this process, as I previously mentioned, takes place in both the general classroom as well as in a one-on-one, more intense support. But tiers 1 and 2 are both held in the general classroom. And that is due to the fact that in order to acquire the most relevant data, grouping does need to take place to assess student need. So tier 1, there are small groups based on heterogeneous needs. And then tier 2, other professionals are brought in to reduce the student-teacher ratio, and more homogeneous groups based on the acquired needs from tier 1 are implemented. So the tier 1 is known as the core instructional program, and some of the characteristics of this tier are to include engaging differentiated instruction for all the students in the classroom. So again, just to be able to assess the needs by engaging in different forms of instruction, because all students learn in different ways. In the integration of common formative assessments to plan for instruction and inform intervention. So again, essentially just another data collection, but it is primarily more formative assessments like tests, quizzes, and whatnot. Again, just to be able to acquire the most relevant and informative data to either stop the process or move on to tier 2. And then, like I mentioned before, organize daily small groups to supports based on need. So this is more heterogeneous, as we're still trying to figure out what those needs are. So tier 2 is the strategic supplemental instruction. And within this tier, some of the characteristics are providing time during daily flexible intervention times during buffer days. So that is essentially just providing a small buffer while intervening with the students to be able to, take a step back and just look at the data and figure out where to move next. Grouping students more homogeneously on specific need, like I mentioned before, since that data was collected from the tier 1 formative assessments and differentiated instruction, they're now able to do a more in-depth grouping and based on the different needs. And like I mentioned before, asking support staff to participate to reduce the student-teacher ratios and to be able to create those smaller homogeneous groups based on that need. And the third tier is the intensive instruction. Now, this is the one tier that is not held within the classroom. It is it could not be held in the classroom, I should say. So some of the characteristics of this tier is that it is recommended for students who require significant intervention relative to their peers in the foundational skills like reading, writing, math, and behavior. And for those students who did not respond to the intervention in both tiers 1 and 2. So that, like I said, that kind of takes them out of the general classroom and puts them in a more isolated environment, for lack of a better term. And this work is to include intensive driven supports based on the data that was not only received and acquired in tier 1 and tier 2, but it is now working with what was acquired in tier 1 and tier 2. And by using and applying this data from the first 2 tiers, within tier 3, educators and different support staffs are able to adjust the support to match the student's needs in a one-on-one basis, and they're able to revise it until the student is adequately responding to that intervention. So now in this slide, we have the different RTI pyramid diagrams. They could be depicted a bunch of different ways. You can have some characteristics with some statistics, or it could just be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. This is what this is what that is. So now we're going to go ahead and specifically take a look at quickly how the RTI process can be applied into the educational journeys of English language learners. Now let's take a look at the RTI process in relation to English language learners. It is important to note that the response intervention or RTI process affects the schooling experiences of all students in the classroom due to the integration of various supports, and this includes the English language learners that will be present in the classroom. It is also important to note that the RTI process is proactive, as it needs to be initiated sooner rather than later to reap the benefits of the supports offered by special education for students who absolutely need it. Sometimes the more traditional route of special education referral can be a little bit too slow or too latent in terms of recognizing, acquiring, and integrating supports. So RTI is a much more expedited process. Now, while this is inherently and intentionally not a negative initiation, it can have a negative impact on the English language learners negatively. Now, it is not uncommon for students to fall behind in the various content objectives that they are learning in their schooling careers. Some lessons may be harder than others, some homeworks or some other assessments may be harder and more difficult and challenging than others, so falling behind is not an uncommon thing within schools. However, since English language learners are doubly learning both a new language as well as course content simultaneously, as that is a baseline for English language learners, there is a higher likelihood that they will fall behind in one or more aspects of their schooling. Now, this can be due to a number of factors, whether they're learning double content, whether that content that they're learning is more challenging and rigorous, whether the place that they're at with their fluency journey is challenging and they're plateauing, or they're falling behind. Whatever the case may be, the initiation of the RTI process without properly assessing whether or not the student is having a difficulty within, whether it be just the acquisition of English or the course material or both, is important, and it's integral to making sure that the RTA process is not being initiated in a manner that is considered too soon. And as Izzy was saying before, the question now raises, how do we know that special education services are not being initiated and integrated into the student's schooling journey too quickly without proper assessment? There is a way to do it, whether that be holding workshops in order to weed out bias and to inform educators and different professionals of the implicit bias or something that may be subconscious, and just calling that forward to make sure that they are being able to properly assess what could be either a language acquisition difficulty or learning disability. Thank you.
Hey everyone, it's Danielle, and I'm going to be talking about testing and evaluating English language learners. So when testing ELLs for special education, it's important to take into consideration their language and cultural background, as well as any potential disabilities or challenges they may be facing either in school or outside of school. It's important to use assessments that are appropriate for ELLs, such as assessments that have been translated into their native language or assessments that have been differentiated. Some assessments may be culturally biased, so it's important to take these cultural differences into account when selecting assessments and interpreting results. In addition to assessments, it's important to gather information from multiple sources, such as the parents of the ELL, the teachers, and other professionals who have worked with the student in the past. It's important to evaluate the student's language proficiency, as it can impact their ability to understand and respond to instructions and questions on the assessments. ELLs who belong to varying ethnic groups are often overrepresented in special education programs due to a variety of factors, including cultural and linguistic differences. ELLs may be misdiagnosed in having a learning disability when in reality they simply just need more support in developing their language skills. Addressing the overrepresentation of ELLs in special education programs requires an approach that takes into account the unique needs and challenges of these students. This may involve providing more resources and supports to the ELLs, addressing systematic inequalities, and promoting greater cultural understanding and sensitivity within schools and other educational settings. When evaluating assessment results, it's important to look for patterns and to consider the student's performance over time rather than solely relying on a single assessment. Overall, the key is to approach the testing process with cultural sensitivity and to focus on the student's individual needs and strengths. Standardized testing is a method of assessing students' knowledge through grade-level achievement tests. All students answer the same set of questions for each subject in the school curriculum to determine their mastery of the material for their grade level. The test covers a range of subjects including art, language, history, math, science, and social studies, and they are used to evaluate the quality of instruction provided to the students. The tests are administered to all students at the same time and in the same manner, usually at the end of a semester, to assess their grade level performance. When it comes to cultural bias, using idioms and phrases that are unique to a particular region or culture can be an example. For instance, the phrase "a baker's dozen" may be unfamiliar to students from certain regions or cultures, and if the phrase is included on the test, most students may not understand what it refers to, which is the number 13. This may lead to cultural bias in assessment, as those students who do not understand the phrase may miss that test item. If you look at the image, there is a man telling a bunch of animals to climb a tree for quote-unquote fair selection. It's obvious that some animals have a clear advantage over others. This is important for people to understand, as being fair doesn't always mean that everyone should get the same thing. In conclusion, addressing the overrepresentation of ELLs in special education requires a comprehensive and holistic approach that considers cultures and linguistic diversity, provides appropriate language support, implements fair assessment practices, and ensures adequate training and support for educators. Collaborative efforts between general education and English language support staff, as well as involving families and communities, can help prevent the misidentification and overrepresentation of ELLs in special education. The misplacement of students in special education is not only stigmatizing, but it can deny individuals the quality and life-enhancing education they deserve. Be sure to follow us at Representation in Special Ed and check out our newsletter. Thank you all for watching. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to email us at our group assignment email, tsoulgroupproject2023@gmail.com. You could also reach us on our Instagram. Again, thank you all for watching, and we hope you enjoyed.